On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, a man named Delmar Huber walked out to his mailbox on County Road 14 in Saline County, Missouri, and found a license plate leaning against his fence post. Not in the mailbox, against the fence post. Someone had driven out to the edge of his property, gotten out of their car, and left it there without knocking. The plate was stripped. The numbers had been ground off. The reflective coating was bubbled and peeling, and someone had tried to punch a third hole through the center that hadn't gone clean. It was, by any reasonable measure, garbage. Delmar picked it up, turned it over twice, and carried it to his barn. That was how it started. Let me tell you about Saline County in 1987 because you need to understand the place before you can understand the man. Saline County sits in the middle of Missouri like a knuckle, flat river-bottom ground along the Missouri River to the north and rolling clay hills to the south. The kind of country where a farm either works or it doesn't, and there's not much in between. The county seat was Marshall, population just under 13,000, and if you needed anything agricultural, seed, parts, equipment, a conversation about what your neighbor was doing wrong, you went to one of three places: the co-op on Route 65, Blevins Farm Supply on the south edge of town, or you drove 40 minutes to Sedalia and hoped they had it. The people who worked those counters had been working them for 20 years. They knew every farm in the county by name, knew which tractors were held together with baling wire and optimism, knew whose check you could cash and whose you couldn't. What they did not know, what nobody in Saline County thought to ask, was what happened to a license plate when it wore out. Let me explain that, because it matters. Missouri, like most states, had a system. When a plate got too worn to read, reflective coating gone, numbers fading, mounting holes cracked out, the state would issue a replacement. The old plate went back to the county assessor's office, and the assessor's office sent them in batches to a recycling contractor in Kansas City, a company called Meridian Reclaim Services, which had held the state contract since 1979. Meridian would strip the plates, aluminum substrate separated from the reflective sheeting, the sheeting sorted and baled, the aluminum sold for scrap. It was a tidy system. It worked. Nobody thought about it, except that somewhere between the assessor's office and Meridian Reclaim Services, plates were going missing. Not many, not enough to trigger an audit, but enough that, over time, a quiet secondary economy had developed in which worn plates, plates that had been stripped of their numbers, plates with damaged reflective surfaces, plates that were bent or punched or otherwise compromised, found their way to people who had uses for them that the state of Missouri had not anticipated. Farmers used the aluminum substrate for patch panels, for flashing, for shims under equipment feet, for a dozen small repairs where a thin, flat piece of corrosion-resistant metal was exactly what you needed, and buying new stock from the hardware store seemed like an unnecessary expense when the thing you needed was already the right size. The plates were, in other words, raw material, and the man who had figured that out earliest and most thoroughly was Delmar Huber. Let me tell you about Delmar Huber because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he built. Delmar was 61 years old in 1987, which meant he had been born in 1926, the year before Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic, the year the Route 66 highway was commissioned, the year before the Great Depression would begin to take shape in ways that nobody in Saline County could yet see. His father, August Huber, had farmed 280 acres on the south side of the county, and had done it through the Depression, and through the war years, and through the drought of 1954, without ever losing the land, which in Saline County was considered a form of heroism that nobody talked about directly. August Huber had done it by wasting nothing. Not a board, not a bolt, not a length of wire. When something wore out on the Huber farm, it became something else. A broken cultivator tooth became a gate hinge. A cracked drive shaft became a fence post brace. The farm was a closed system, and August ran it with the quiet ferocity of a man who understood that the margin between staying and leaving was thinner than most people wanted to admit. Delmar had learned this from his father, the way children learn language. Not from instruction, but from immersion, from watching, from the slow accumulation of 10,000 small observations, until the principle became instinct. By the time he took over the farm in 1961, when August's knees gave out and his eyes went bad enough that he couldn't judge distance on a slope, Delmar was already the kind of man who looked at a broken thing and saw its next life before he saw its current failure. He farmed 280 acres of corn and soybeans, kept a small herd of Angus cattle on the south pasture, and in his spare time, which was not much, but which he guarded carefully, he repaired things. Not just his own things. Other people's things. A neighbor's baler, a cousin's grain auger, the co-op's ancient scale that nobody else could figure out. He charged almost nothing for this, and when people asked why he didn't charge more, he said the same thing every time. He said he was getting paid in problems, and problems were more interesting than money. The barn on the Huber place had, by 1987, become something that people in Saline County described with a mixture of admiration and unease. It was organized. That was the first thing you noticed. Not in the way a hardware store is organized with labels and bins and a system designed for strangers, but in the way a man's memory is organized, which is to say that it made complete sense to exactly one person and was impenetrable to everyone else. The south wall was lumber, rough-cut oak, dimensional pine, a stack of 1x6 cedar that Delmar had pulled from a demolished granary in 1974. The north wall was metal, angle iron, flat bar, pipe in 4 diameters, and, beginning in the spring of 1983, license plates. Not a few, not a curiosity. By 1987, there were several hundred of them, sorted by condition, flat and usable on one rack, bent but salvageable on another, too compromised for structural use but good for flashing on a third. They were stacked on edge like records in a crate, and if you asked Delmar where a particular plate had come from, he could usually tell you. That one from the fence post on County Road 14. That batch of 40 from a man named Cresswell who had worked at the assessor's office and understood that Delmar would make use of them. That stack of 60 from a body shop in Marshall that had been using plates as masking shields during spray jobs and had accumulated a surplus. People in Saline County knew about the plates the way they knew about a lot of things on the Huber place, as background, as local color, as one of those facts about a neighbor that you absorb without ever quite deciding what to make of it. The man collected worn-out license plates. All right. Delmar had never explained himself, and nobody had ever asked him to. He was not the kind of man who invited questions about his methods, and he was not the kind of man who offered explanations without being asked. He worked, he repaired, he accumulated. And he waited with the patience of a man who had grown up watching his father wait out droughts, for the moment when the thing he had been accumulating would be needed. That moment came in the fall of 1993, though the conditions for it had been building for 2 years. Let me tell you about what happened to Meridian Reclaim Services, because that is where the story turns. Meridian had held the Missouri plate recycling contract since 1979, and for most of that time they had operated without incident. They were not a large company. 40 employees at peak, a processing facility in the West Bottoms neighborhood of Kansas City, a fleet of 3 trucks for pickup routes. Their business model depended on 2 things: the state contract, which paid them a per-plate processing fee, and the aluminum scrap market, which gave them a secondary revenue stream on the substrate material. In the late 1980s, both of those things began to go wrong simultaneously. The state, under budget pressure, renegotiated the contract at a lower per-plate rate. The aluminum scrap market, which had been reasonably strong through most of the decade, softened in 1990 and stayed soft. Meridian began cutting corners. They stopped making some of the rural pickup runs, which meant that plates that should have gone to Kansas City stayed in county assessor offices, which meant that the informal economy of plates to farmers that had been running quietly for years began to dry up. And then, in September of 1993, Meridian Reclaim Services filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and ceased operations entirely. The state of Missouri spent 8 months finding a replacement contractor. During those 8 months, the assessor's offices across the state accumulated plates with nowhere to send them. Some offices, following the letter of the law, locked the plates in storage and waited. Others, following local custom, continued to let them drift toward people who would use them. But the volume dropped sharply, and in Saline County, the informal supply that Delmar Huber had been drawing on for a decade slowed to almost nothing. This would not have mattered to most people, but Delmar had, by 1993, built something that depended on that supply. Let me tell you about what Delmar had built, because this is the part of the story that most people in Saline County didn't understand until it was too late to take back what they'd said about it. The plates had started as raw material, aluminum substrate for patches and repairs. But somewhere around 1985, Delmar had begun to notice something about the reflective sheeting that was still intact on the better-conditioned plates. The sheeting was a retroreflective microprismatic material, which is a technical way of saying that it was engineered to bounce light directly back toward its source with very high efficiency. The state of Missouri had been using this material on license plates since the mid-1970s as a safety measure. A plate that bounced light back toward a following driver's headlights was easier to read at night, which meant fewer accidents, which meant the state paid out less in damages. The material was manufactured by a company in Ohio, applied to aluminum blanks in a plant in Jefferson City, and was, by any measure, an excellent product. It was also, Delmar had discovered, extraordinarily useful for purposes the state had not intended. He had first used it in 1985 to repair a greenhouse on the Vandermeer Place, 3 miles east of his farm. The Vandermeers grew tomatoes and peppers in a small commercial operation, and their greenhouse had a north-facing interior wall that didn't get enough reflected light to keep the plants on that side from running leggy and pale. Delmar had suggested, without being asked, that he might be able to help. He had lined the north wall with license plates, reflective side out, overlapping them like shingles and fastening them to the studs with sheet metal screws. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The reflective surface bounced the light coming in through the south-facing glass panels back across the interior, and within 2 growing seasons the Vandermeers were reporting consistent yields across the full width of the greenhouse instead of the 2/3 they'd been managing before. They did not pay Delmar for this. He had not asked them to. He had asked them, instead, to tell him if it stopped working. It did not stop working. Word moved the way word moves in a county of 12,000 people. Slowly at first, then all at once. By 1989, Delmar had lined the interiors of 4 more greenhouses in Saline County, 2 cold storage buildings where the reflective surface was being used to redirect heat lamp output rather than sunlight, and the interior of a Farrowing barn on the Sorensen place, where the supplemental heat lamps over the Piglet Creek areas had been struggling to maintain temperature on the north end. He had also, in a project that people talked about for years afterward, used plates to create a passive solar reflector array on the south-facing slope behind the Kowalski Place's machine shed, angling them to direct winter sunlight through a south window and across a concrete thermal mass that kept the shed above freezing without a propane heater. The Kowalskis had been spending $400 a year on propane to keep that shed warm enough to work in. After Delmar's installation, they spent nothing. None of this had been planned. None of it had been designed in any formal sense. Delmar had looked at problems and seen, in the material he had been accumulating for years, solutions that nobody else had thought to look for because nobody else had been accumulating that material. He was not an engineer. He had no training in optics or thermodynamics. What he had was 40 years of watching how light and heat moved through agricultural buildings, a barn full of retroreflective material, and the particular kind of intelligence that expresses itself not in credentials but in the patient, systematic observation of how things actually work. By 1993, when Meridian Reclaim Services folded and the supply of plates began to dry up, Delmar had commitments, informal, unwritten, but real, to 3 more greenhouse projects and a cold storage retrofit on a potato operation near Miami, Missouri, that the Rasmussen family had been planning for 2 years. He had enough plates on hand to complete 2 of the greenhouse jobs. He did not have enough for the Rasmussen cold storage project, which required approximately 340 plates in good reflective condition, and which was, by the Rasmussens' own accounting, worth about $3,200 a year in reduced electricity costs once operational. The Rasmussens had been waiting. They had been patient. And now the supply had stopped. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When you run out of the material you need, and the supplier has folded, and the replacement supplier hasn't been named yet, and the thing you're building isn't something you can explain to a hardware store clerk because it doesn't exist in any catalog, what do you do? Most people would have told the Rasmussens they were sorry, that the situation had changed, that they'd have to find another solution. Most people would have called it an unfortunate circumstance and moved on. Delmar Huber was not most people. He drove to Marshall and had a conversation with a man named Gene Crowley. Let me tell you about Gene Crowley, because you need to understand what Delmar was walking into. Gene Crowley was 54 years old in 1993 and had been the Saline County Assessor for 11 years. Before that, he had been the Deputy Assessor for 6 years, and before that, he had worked at the County Clerk's office for 4 years, which meant that Gene Crowley had been a fixture of Saline County government for more than 2 decades, and had developed, over those 2 decades, the particular confidence of a man who has never been seriously wrong about anything within his jurisdiction. He was not a bad man. He was not corrupt. He was thorough, organized, and genuinely committed to the proper administration of his office. He was also, in the way of men who have held the same position of authority for a long time, absolutely certain that he already knew everything relevant about every situation he was likely to encounter. Delmar drove to the assessor's office on a Wednesday afternoon in October of 1993. He was wearing his canvas work jacket and his seed cap, and his hands were the color and texture of old saddle leather, and he sat down across from Gene Crowley and explained, in the fewest words he could manage, what he needed. He needed access to the plates that were accumulating in storage. Not to buy them. The state owned them and the disposal protocol was clear. But perhaps an arrangement could be made. Perhaps the assessor's office could document the plates as transferred for agricultural research purposes, which was not entirely inaccurate, and Delmar would provide a written accounting of their use, which he was prepared to do. Gene Crowley listened to this with the expression of a man who has heard a great many unusual requests and has learned to let the silence do the work of refusal. When Delmar finished, Gene said that he appreciated the creativity of the proposal, but that the plates were state property, and the disposal protocol was clear, and that he was not in a position to make exceptions, even informal ones, even for agricultural purposes, even for a man he'd known for 30 years. He said this pleasantly and without apology, because he genuinely believed he was right, and he probably was right, technically, about the protocol. What he was wrong about was the significance of what Delmar was doing with the plates. Gene Crowley had no idea what was growing in the Vandermeer greenhouse, or what the Kowalskis were saving on propane, or what the Rasmussens were waiting for. He had no frame for it. To him, Delmar Huber was a farmer who wanted scrap metal, and scrap metal had a disposal protocol, and the disposal protocol was clear. Delmar thanked him and left. He drove home on County Road 14, past the fence post where the first plate had appeared 6 years earlier, and he sat in his truck in the driveway for a while before going inside. His wife, Lorene, was in the kitchen, and she asked how it went without looking up from what she was doing, because she had been married to Delmar for 38 years and had learned to read the sound of his truck pulling in. Delmar said it went the way he'd expected. Lorene said she was sorry. Delmar said there was no need to be sorry, that he'd find another way, and he went out to the barn. What he found, over the next 3 weeks, was that the informal network he'd been drawing on for years was more resilient than he'd realized. The supply from the assessor's office was blocked, but the supply from everywhere else, body shops, farm equipment dealers who used plates as masking shields, the occasional neighbor who'd found a pile of them in a ditch, was still trickling. It was not enough, but it was something. And Delmar Huber, who had learned from his father that the margin between staying and leaving was thinner than most people wanted to admit, had also learned that thin margins were not the same as no margin. He started making phone calls. Let me tell you about the phone calls, because this is a part of the story that people in Saline County found hardest to believe when they heard about it later. Delmar called the county assessors in 7 neighboring counties. He called the county clerk in Pettis County, who had been at school with his brother-in-law. He called a man he knew at the Missouri Farm Bureau, who knew a man at the State Department of Revenue, who handled the plate disposal contracts. He called 3 body shops in Sedalia and 2 in Columbia. He called the manager of a parking garage in Kansas City, who had once bought a used tractor from him and still owed him a favor. He was not aggressive about any of this. He was not a salesman. He explained, in each case, what he was doing and why, and he asked whether the person he was talking to knew of any plates that were accumulating somewhere without a destination. He did not offer money. He offered, in each case, to provide a written account of what the plates were used for and what the result was, because he had learned that people who worked in government offices and commercial businesses were more comfortable with transactions they could document. It took 6 weeks, but by the end of November 1993, Delmar had located and arranged the transfer of 412 plates from 5 different sources. 2 county assessor offices that had been quietly sitting on accumulated stock, a body shop in Sedalia that had 300 plates in a dumpster it hadn't gotten around to emptying, a parking garage in Kansas City that had been using plates as wheel chalk markers and had a surplus, and a retired highway department worker in Pettis County who had a garage full of plates he'd accumulated over 20 years of picking them up off roadsides. None of these transfers were formally authorized. All of them were documented by Delmar in a ledger he kept in the barn, with the source, the date, the quantity, the condition assessment, and the eventual use of each plate. He was not hiding what he was doing. He was simply doing it in the space between the official system's collapse and the replacement system's arrival, in the way that farmers have always operated in the space between what the rules say and what the land requires. The Rasmussen Cold Storage Project was completed in February of 1994. The reflective plate array covered 680 square feet of interior wall surface in the storage facility, redirecting the output of 12 heat retention lamps across the stored potato crop with an efficiency that the Rasmussens measured, carefully and skeptically, across 2 full storage seasons before they were willing to say publicly what the numbers showed. What the numbers showed was that their electricity costs for climate maintenance in that facility had dropped by 61% compared to the 2-year average before the installation. On a facility that had been spending approximately $5,400 a year on electricity for that purpose, this represented a savings of just under $3,300 annually. The plates had cost nothing. Delmar's labor had cost nothing, because he had not charged for it. The Rasmussens had tried to pay him, and he had declined, and when they pushed, he had said the same thing he always said. He was getting paid in problems. Now let me tell you about what happened in the spring of 1994, because this is where the story stops being about one man and starts being about a county. The replacement contractor for Missouri's plate recycling program was announced in April of 1994. It was a company called Central States Materials, based in Springfield, and they were larger and better capitalized than Meridian had been, and they moved quickly to clear the backlog that had accumulated in county assessor offices across the state. This meant that the informal supply of plates that Delmar had been drawing on, the assessor's office overflow, the body shop surpluses, the accumulated stock in county garages, was now going to be systematically collected and processed through official channels. The informal economy was closing. The plates were going back into the system. Gene Crowley called Delmar in May of 1994 to let him know that Central States Materials would be picking up the accumulated stock from the Saline County Assessor's Office the following week. He said this, Delmar would later tell Lorene, in the tone of a man delivering news he expected to be unwelcome. Delmar thanked him and said he appreciated the call. There was a pause on the line, and then Gene said, almost as an afterthought, that he'd heard something about the Rasmussen place, about what Delmar had done with the plates in their storage facility. He said he'd heard the numbers. He said he wasn't sure he believed the numbers. Delmar said the numbers were accurate, and that the Rasmussens kept good records, and that Gene was welcome to go look for himself. Another pause. Gene said he might do that. Delmar said that would be fine. Gene Crowley drove out to the Rasmussen place in June of 1994. He spent 2 hours there. He looked at the installation, he looked at the electricity bills, he looked at the ledger the Rasmussens kept. He drove back to Marshall and sat in his office for a while. Then he called Delmar. He said he owed Delmar an apology, and Delmar said he didn't think he did. Gene said he thought the situation the previous fall had been handled in a way that in retrospect, had not served the county's interests. Delmar said that was generous of him to say. Gene said he was wondering whether there was a way to formalize what Delmar had been doing, not to put it under government oversight exactly, but to make it easier. To create a documentation pathway that would allow plates to be transferred for agricultural use without requiring the informal arrangements that Delmar had been managing on his own. Delmar was quiet for a moment, and then he said he thought that was a fine idea, and that he'd be happy to help design the documentation if Gene wanted to work on it together. They spent the better part of that summer working on it. What they came up with was not a formal program. Missouri didn't have the legislative appetite for that, and Delmar didn't want the overhead. What they came up with was a memorandum of understanding between the Saline County Assessor's Office and a list of named agricultural operations, establishing that plates deemed unsuitable for reprocessing, plates that were too damaged or too corroded to be worth the recycling contractor's effort, could be transferred to those operations for documented agricultural use. It was a narrow exception carved into a bureaucratic process by two men who had spent 40 years learning how things actually worked, and it was, by any measure, a minor administrative document. But it meant that Delmar Huber's barn would have a legal supply of plates for the foreseeable future, and that the work he had been doing for a decade would not have to depend on the informal economy of found material and owed favors. The memorandum was signed in September of 1994. Gene Crowley brought it to Delmar's barn on a Tuesday afternoon, and they shook hands over it, and Lorene brought out coffee, and the three of them sat in the barn for an hour among the sorted racks of plates and talked about nothing in particular. It was, by the standards of Saline County, a significant occasion, and all three of them treated it as if it were entirely ordinary, which is the Saline County way. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in 1994. Between 1994 and 2001, Delmar completed installations in 11 more agricultural buildings in Saline County and 4 in neighboring counties. The applications had diversified beyond what he'd originally imagined. In addition to greenhouse light enhancement and cold storage heat retention, he had developed a method for using plates to create passive solar water preheating systems for livestock operations. A simple array of plates angled to focus winter sunlight on a black-painted water tank, reducing the energy required to keep the water from freezing by a margin that varied by installation but averaged. Across 6 installations he tracked carefully about 40%. He had also, in a project that surprised even him, used plates to address a problem at a hog confinement operation near Nelson, Missouri, where the ventilation system was creating cold spots in the building that were affecting animal health. The plates, positioned to redirect the output of supplemental heat lamps, eliminated the cold spots without requiring additional heating capacity. The operator, a man named Lyle Borgman, had been quoted $11,000 by a ventilation contractor to solve the problem with additional equipment. Delmar's solution cost the price of the sheet metal screws. Word had, by this point, moved well beyond Saline County. Delmar had been contacted by farmers in Pettis County, Cooper County, and Howard County. He had driven to 3 counties in Iowa to look at greenhouse problems. He had exchanged letters, actual letters, because Delmar did not own a computer and had no intention of acquiring one, with a man in Wisconsin who had read about the Rasmussen installation in a regional agricultural newsletter and wanted to know more. He answered every letter. He drove to every farm that asked him to come. He charged nothing. He was 72 years old in 2001, and the barn had approximately 2,400 plates in inventory, sorted with the same system he had been using since the beginning, and the ledger on the workbench had grown to 4 volumes, each one documenting sources, dates, quantities, conditions, and outcomes in Delmar's careful, unhurried handwriting. The ledger was not a business record. It was not a research document. It was something between a diary and a proof. The accumulated record of a man who had looked at a thing everyone else considered garbage and had spent 18 years demonstrating, one installation at a time, that he was right about what it was. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What do you call a man who spends 18 years being right about something that everyone around him thought was eccentric at best and foolish at worst? What do you call the kind of patience that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't seek recognition, that just keeps working and documenting and waiting for the world to catch up? In Saline County, they didn't call it anything. They just drove out to his barn when they had a problem they couldn't solve any other way. Let me tell you about the summer of 2002, because that is when the story found its coda. A woman named Dr. Patricia Ellison, who was an extension specialist at the University of Missouri's Agricultural Engineering program, had been tracking a cluster of unusually efficient cold storage operations in central Missouri as part of a study on low-cost energy conservation in small agricultural facilities. 3 of the operations in her data set were in Saline County, and all 3 of them had the same anomalous characteristic. Their energy efficiency numbers were significantly better than the models predicted, and none of them had any conventional efficiency upgrades, no additional insulation, no upgraded HVAC, no new lighting systems. When she drove to Saline County to find out why, she was directed, by everyone she asked, to a farm on County Road 14. She spent 3 days at the Huber place. She brought a photometer and a thermal imaging camera and a laptop computer, none of which Delmar had any interest in, though he was polite about it. She measured the reflective output of the plate installations in 3 different facilities and compared them to standard retroreflective materials available commercially. What she found was that the plates, which had been manufactured to state specifications for nighttime road visibility, were performing at retroreflective efficiency levels that were, in some conditions, comparable to commercial agricultural reflective film sold for greenhouse use at approximately 85 cents per square foot. The plates were free. The commercial film cost 85 cents per square foot. The plates were covering, across all of Delmar's installations in Saline County alone, approximately 9,400 square feet of agricultural building interior. The arithmetic was not complicated. She asked Delmar if he had ever considered publishing what he'd learned. He said he had considered it and decided against it, because he didn't think publishing was the right format for what he knew. She asked what format he thought was right. He thought about this for a while, and then he said he thought the right format was a barn full of plates and a ledger full of outcomes and a willingness to drive to wherever the problem was. She wrote that down. Her study was published in the Journal of Extension in the spring of 2003. It documented 5 installations in detail, presented the photometric data, calculated the aggregate energy savings across all documented Huber installations at approximately $47,000 over the period from 1985 to 2002, and concluded with a section on the implications for low-cost agricultural energy conservation that cited Delmar Huber's work as a case study in what the paper called practitioner-derived innovation in resource-limited agricultural settings. It was a careful, measured academic paper, and it said, in the language of academic papers, that a farmer in Saline County, Missouri, had been right for 18 years about something that nobody else had thought to investigate. Gene Crowley read the paper. He drove out to the Huber place on a Saturday morning in June of 2003, which was the second time in 10 years he had made that drive with something specific on his mind. He sat down with Delmar at the workbench in the barn, among the 4 volumes of the ledger and the sorted racks of plates, and he said that he had read the study and that he wanted to say something he should have said in 1993. Delmar said he didn't think anything needed to be said. Gene said he disagreed. He said that in 1993 he had made a decision based on protocol and had not bothered to understand what he was deciding about, and that this was a failure of the kind of judgment that his position required, and that he was sorry for it. Delmar was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Gene had called him when the new contractor came in, and that the call had mattered, and that he considered the account settled. Gene said he appreciated that. They sat for a while longer, and then Gene asked how many plates were currently in inventory. Delmar said he thought about 2,200, give or take. Gene asked how long that would last. Delmar said he didn't know. He said the new contractor was more efficient than Meridian had been, and the memorandum of understanding only covered plates that were genuinely unsuitable for reprocessing, and those were getting scarcer. He said he was working on it. He was always working on it. Let me tell you one last thing about Delmar Huber, because the story doesn't end with the study, or with Gene Crowley's apology, or with the memorandum of understanding that is still, as of the last time anyone checked, on file in the Saline County Assessor's Office. Delmar died in April of 2009, at the age of 82, in the same house where he had been born, on the same 280 acres his father had held through the Depression and the war years and the drought of 1954. He was buried in the Methodist Cemetery in Marshall, and the service was attended by more people than the church could comfortably hold, which surprised his children and did not surprise Lorene, who had been married to him for 54 years and understood, better than anyone, the difference between a man who seeks recognition and a man who earns it without trying. The barn is still there. His son, August, named for his grandfather, farms the land now, and he maintains the barn the way his father maintained it, which is to say, with the same system that makes complete sense to exactly one person and is impenetrable to everyone else. There are still plates in inventory, though the supply has changed. August has found new sources, a recycling center in Marshall that pulls unsuitable plates before they go to the contractor, a couple of body shops in Sedalia that know to call him, a network that is smaller than his father's but still functional. He still uses them the way his father used them. He still charges nothing for the installations he does for neighbors. He still keeps the ledger, now in its 7th volume, with the same categories his father established: source, date, quantity, condition, outcome. A few years ago, August's daughter, Delmar's granddaughter, a 23-year-old named Claire, who had studied environmental engineering at Missouri S&T and had come back to the farm after graduation, which surprised everyone except Lorene, who was 91 and still sharp enough to have seen it coming, proposed an addition to the system. She had been looking at the data in the ledgers, all 7 volumes, and she had run the numbers through modeling software her professors had taught her to use, and she had found something her grandfather had not been able to see because he hadn't had the tools. The installations were not performing uniformly. Some were significantly more efficient than others, and the variation correlated with factors that could be predicted: plate age, coating type, angle of installation, seasonal light angle. If you could optimize those variables, she told August, you could improve the average installation efficiency by an estimated 22%, without changing the material or the cost. August looked at her across the workbench in the barn, in the same spot where his father had sat with Gene Crowley in 2003, and he thought about it for a while. Then he said yes. He said it the way his father would have said it, without ceremony, without qualification, without making it into anything more than what it was, which was a man recognizing that the person in front of him had seen something he hadn't, and that the right response to that was not pride or skepticism, but the simple willingness to let the work continue. Claire Huber is currently running trials on 6 installations in Saline County, measuring efficiency against her model's predictions, refining the variables, keeping her own ledger in the same barn where her great-great-grandfather's tools still hang on the south wall. She uses software her grandfather never heard of to analyze material her grandfather never explained to anyone because he didn't think explanation was the right format for what he knew. She thinks it is. She's writing it up. The plates are still coming in. Someone left 3 of them against the fence post on County Road 14 last spring, the way someone left the first one in 1987, and August picked them up and carried them to the barn without knocking on any doors or asking any questions, because that is how things work on the Huber place, and how they have always worked, and how they will probably keep working long after the ledger fills its 8th volume and starts its 9th. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. And sometimes the person who remembers isn't the one who built them. Sometimes it's the one who picked them up off the ground and carried them somewhere they could still be useful, and then kept going back to pick up more for 18 years, until the world finally thought to ask why. That's what happens when a man sees treasure where everyone else sees.